Hey there, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this little mini lecture that I'm recording. And its theme today is really looking at something that I've always been interested in, which is I always hear students say I'm the customer or someone assuming the professor's the boss, but there's this myth of control. So, not the boss. We're going to look through Luke's lens of the three dimensions of power, actor network theory, and the myth of control in higher education. But today I wanted to start with a little bit of a disclaimer as well, because I'm looking at some odd theory choices. So, I'm going to read it to you, which is students, I wanted to add this disclaimer before this lecture before we start. And it says as follows. This lecture pairs two theoretical lenses that don't always align per se. Stephen Lukes, as amazing as he is, helps us understand and helps us analyze power as something exercised, even when invisible or internalized. And then the actor network lens that we're going to use, by contrast, doesn't start with power at all. It starts with relationships, systems, and translations. However, if we're asking how students, professors, and universities come to behave the way that they do, both lenses are useful, in my particular assumption here and like my thoughts here. One shows us the structure, this would be Luke's, and the other the scaffolding, this would be actor network theory. And together they help us understand not just what we do, but how those actions become normalized per se. This class, Soc 334, Tech and Society, is made to help you see how you can take concepts, ideas of this course and explore that sociological imagination in all things and more. So beware and let's get along with it, shall we? So, are you here by choice, or was it the choice that was already made? Most students believe they freely choose their major, their school, and their classes. But did they? And let's challenge this assumption, right? In this lecture, we're going to explore how actor network theory and Stephen Luke's theory of power helps us reimagine the university not as a place we simply attend, but as a network of power, obligation, technology, and normativity that shapes students and professors alike. This isn't just about one person making choices, it's about how the networks assemble people into particular roles: the student, the professor, the successful graduate. So, according to Luke's, that shaping happens in layers. There's the first dimension in where choice seems visible. You clicked register, right? The second dimension is where the list of choices was already filtered by catalog requirement, financial constraints, or institutional design. And then the third dimension is where power is most effective. It works by shaping what feels natural, like choosing a particular major, because you just know, you just know it's the right move. And this is where we kind of start seeing these different components that go into here. So let's start mapping that network, right? The actor network theory reminds us actors are not just people. They're also technologies, rules, policies, buildings, syllabi, algorithm, and accreditation forms. In this web, the student is linked to, let's say, Canvas or FAFSA, degree audits, advisors, dorms, even Life 360, which gets inverted and emailed out, and group chats, let's say. The professor connects through these connections like Zoom, the rubrics, the department policies, AI plagiarism tools, student reviews, and more. And the parent connects via financial influences, major suggestions, so like things they're suggesting to their children, remote surveillance, tuition deadlines. And then the university is black boxed actor, composed of accreditation agencies, course catalogs, campus apps, alumni pressure, and legal liability. In the actor network theory, power is not possessed per se. It emerges from the strength and stability of relationships within this network. The stronger the tie, let's say between GPA and financial aid, the more behavior is patterned through that tie, let's say. And if we use that concept, but then we can also see how Luke's helps us identify how those ties exert said power, right? Going back to that first dimension, the student emails the professor grades an assignment. And these can be seen as like obvious moves, right? Second dimension, the system decides what is even possible, how your GPA is calculated, how you're categorized as full-time, or what deadlines shape your week, right? And then the third dimension, by Luke's, the student internalizes this architecture as normal, feeling like they're doing college right per se, when they maximize credits or hustle for internships, without realizing that they're reinforcing this institutionalized script. So we can see on here this kind of mapping of the networks of these various roles, looking at it both from the ant perspective, but also Luke's. But let's also put it up here for a little bit further of a conversation. Luke's power, if you're not familiar with it, has three dimensions. There's the visible actions, what's on the table, and the internalized beliefs. First, power is visible in conflicts: who wins when interests clash, right? Laws, decision, and votes. Second, power is hidden in agenda setting: what issues get excluded before decisions are made. And third, power is internalized: people are shaped to accept or desire what's expected of them, even when it harms their own interests. And this becomes very interesting when we think about Stephen Lukes and how he distinguishes power not as just something seen, but as something felt and believed. And on your slide, it breaks that down. But let's look at that through these lenses. The first dimension, as we've talked about, observable conflicts, right? A student challenges a grade. So that student is in that position where they're emailing the professor, like we said, and the professor has that assignment graded. Going to that second dimension again, what gets on the agenda? Who decides what counts as valid knowledge in the syllabus, right? So that goes into the system, is decides what's even possible. How have I set up in this kind of arrangement between these networks? And in that third decision or third dimension, we have the shaping wants, desires, even identities. A student chooses business over art because it's quote unquote practical. But where did this idea come from would be interesting. In Luke's third dimension, power is most effective because it makes resistance feel unnecessary or even absurd. It operates by coercion, but not by coercion, but by normalization, right? Apply this to college. If students believe they must get an internship, must double major, or must study STEM to be quote unquote successful, that third dimensional power is in action. And we can start seeing this. But Ant gives us the network. So we see the kind of lenses that are there. But Luke's helps us map how that network controls us, even if it looks like we're free. And this is where I think these two really are become an interesting conversation, even though, as the disclaimer says, you wouldn't usually see these individuals talking together, right? It would be something a little bit different. And that's what I wanted to look at. So let's start this conversation around the student-customer illusion, right? The myth of the student customer. It's common to hear, I'm paying for this class, so I'm the customer. And that can make a lot of sense. But this framing is oversimplification within the relationship and masks a deeper power, masks how deeper power flows per se, right? The actor network theory and Lukes would challenge it on multiple fronts. And here's some examples, right? Ant shows that students as configured actors, not autonomous consumers, right? They are shaped by tuition price models, GPA thresholds, graduation audits, and debt obligations. Whereas Luke's third dimension reveals that even the desire to be seen as a customer is produced by neoliberal logics that turn education into a product and identity into branding, right? So it becomes interesting to see. In truth, students are subjects to the institutional rules, products for employers, data points for retention metrics, conduits for university rankings, and also prestige. And so calling oneself a customer might feel empowering, but it also may be internalized narrative that limits resistance or reflecting on structural constraints per se. And if we zoom out, right, and we look a little bit further, we can look back into Luke's dimensions again. First dimension, a student complains about that course, right? A visible pushback. The second dimension, students never get to shape the terms of tuition. This isn't in their control. So we see the idea of classroom sizes or how degrees are evaluated per se. And then we look at that third dimension again, the idea that you're a customer becomes so accepted, it limits how you see yourself in that system. Power is masked in a kind of entitlement per se. So looking further on this, we can see, what about the professor, right? That conversation. Is the professor the boss or not? Which is kind of the theme of this entire lecture. Well, at first glance, professor may seem in charge. They set deadlines, give grades, they assign the readings. They're in that kind of position of an interesting level of authority, right? But Luke's and Ant would both disagree on this point, right? It would be that Ant reminds us the professors are not sovereign actors. They are disciplined through templates, student evaluations, departmental expectations, Title IX, ADA rules, and accreditation criteria. Even their lecture slides may be pre-approved, right? If they want to talk about X or Y, it really depends upon their positionality, especially if you're talking career track versus tenure track and the institutional limitations. Luke's second dimension, professor appears to set the agenda, but the agenda itself is pre-bound by what counts as rigor, right? What must be covered to meet the learning outcomes? Here at ASU, we have guidelines on what needs to be taught, or what software platforms limit assignments to be formatted, right? What are we going to have there? This illusion or the illusion of power is often stronger than its reality, right? And like students, professors are actors operating inside a designed network. And they're shaped just as much as they shape others, which is an interesting conversation. Again, if we zoom out to look at Luke's in this kind of conversation, the first dimension, the professor says no to late work. Simple, right? Second dimension, they are constrained by institutional policy and review systems they didn't design, so they may not have as much control. Third dimension, even the professor might believe they're in charge because power has worked through normalization and consent. So how someone sees themselves in that lecture hall may have some impact on it when we're looking at this element. But this leads us to the next slide, which is the student as the product, going back into the customer conversation. So who or what is the student? How do we understand that? The actor network theory urges us to deconstruct this identity. A student is bound by academic calendars, filtered through GPA grades, nudged by recommendation algorithms, right? Located by parental tracking apps, or making sure, depending upon how much control a parent has, how their grades are working in that semester stuff, right? And quantified by, even nowadays, with the over examination of AI essay scores, right? Think about Turnitin.com prior to even OpenAI being around. So if we look at Luke's third dimension again, it applies here. The ideal student is not just a cultural type. It's a technologically produced subject designed by rubrics, productivity norms, and career service pipelines per se. And they may believe they are freely becoming themselves, per se, the student, but the very shape of that self is scaffolding by unseen forces, per se. Again, looking back at that three-dimension element here, Luke's reminds us, the first dimension, the student completes assignments and participates. Second dimension, their weekly structure and academic benchmark are determined long before they arrive. In the third dimension, they strive to be the kind of student the system wants without questioning who built the mold that they are holding themselves accountable for. And that leads us into the next slide, which is this idea of the university as a system. Little joke on top of the slide, Life 360, but University 360. But we're going to look at kind of that university system structure, right? So the university is often imagined as a place, a campus, a building, a brand. Actor network theory says it's a network, stabilized through accreditation mandates, financial aid systems, academic publishing, enrollment dashboards, HR policies, and risk management. An example here is, I know it goes back and forth between U of A and ASU, but the architecture department, and if it has accreditation, is something to think about when you're looking into a program. But does a student know to check accreditation status before they are going into an institution? Or do they assume that it's already in a position? Something to think about, that the university does not wield power like a king. It organizes and has different agreements. It organizes rules, affordances, and default settings that guide behavior rather than demand obedience per se. So if we look at this kind of understanding and look into a lens of someone who uses disciplinary power, Foucault's biopower can also fit here that we've talked about in this class. The university doesn't just teach. It produces life-governed subjects. Your health, schedule, finances, and sociality, right, almost said sociology, are managed through systems designed for optimization, not autonomy. And we can sharpen this with Luke's again. With the first dimension, the university enforces deadlines, schedules, and rules. Second dimension, it sets criteria for success, right? What counts as education and how you must move through it when you think about majors, prereqs, and all these things. And in the third dimension, we see that you come to see the university as metrics and your own goals, and even measure your worth by them. How do we look at people's evaluations of self-worth inside what university they go to, and how do they govern these systems? But that leads us into our next slides, that we see that parents are the silent architects, right? We see this kind of ghost actor in the network, Deus ex machina, right? Parents rarely appear in lectures, but their power pulses through the system, right? They fund tuition or use that funding to guide major choices. They push for a return on investment, or ROI, right? What job, ROI, if you don't know ROI is an acronym, what job will that degree get you? A constant thread that you're going to see on Instagram, TikTok, always pointing out which degrees yield the most ROI, and why does that become the metric? They check grades through family portals or demand updates. And a little anecdote here for you. I've had instances especially in my introductory sociology courses, where I've had parents email me, and I have to check if they have gotten the signature to be able to email me for me to even possibly respond. But this becomes a pertinent example. I had a student a couple semesters ago whose mother emailed me and said if this didn't change or this was not done right, they were going to show up every day to class and be able to talk with me and never stop trying to talk with me to make sure that their son was getting what they believed was to be the proper grade. An interesting situation when we looked at this idea of this ghost parent in the network. So the actor network theory calls them remote actors, present through economic structures, expectations, and effective connections. Luke's would say that say this third dimension influence, parental hopes, fears become internalized goals. The student's choice of a major already crowded by voices that are not present. Think about how many times you may have heard someone say they're changing their major, but their parents would never let them, right? Even silence from a parent, disapproval unspoken, can exert shaping pressures towards choices. If I chose this degree, my parents would never respect me, etc., etc. And if we trace the dimensions again, that first dimension, the parent asks you to change majors. Second dimension, they constrain your options through financial dependency or subtle pressure. Third dimension, you think you're acting independently, but their influence has already shaped your range of reasonable decision making. And this is where we can see one of the conversations of what becomes black boxed, right? In actor network theory, a black box is a network that becomes so stable the inner workings are hidden. A college degree is a perfect black box. What do we see? The graduation cap, the job placement, the success story, right? What's inside? Rubric tweaks, drop and add policies, late night mental health crises, group projects gone wrong, tuition panic, quiet withdrawals. Luke's reminds us here, when power works best, it's least visible. The student is told, just work hard, not here's how the system is wired. So this expectation has become black boxed and also becomes invisible towards shaping factors and make many of the decisions for us. And our job as sociology students and sociologists is to de-black box success, make the invisible visible. Think of C. Wright Mills's sociological imagination. So again, pulling into that first, second, and third dimension, the first, success is rewarded publicly. Second, the institution defines what success means. Third, you come to believe success must look like. What do you think it looks like? And you can often feel failure when it doesn't. And this brings us to kind of the last conversation when we conclude this actor network theory plus Luke's and how we could take this into our everyday life in this little mini lecture. So a synthesized conclusion per se. Together, actor network theory and Luke's may not be something that would usually be put together, but they give us tools to understand how universities don't just educate, they engineer identities. The actor network theory maps the actors, the devices, platforms, policies, and people that organize. Luke's maps the power, how that behavior is influenced, limited, and made to feel per se natural, right? This lecture wasn't about blaming systems or looking at anything in that kind of totality. It's about awareness. When we understand how power works, we better understand how to think sociologically about our own position in that network. So the question isn't just, what did you choose? It's also, who helped you decide? And so when we hit that question that inspired me to kind of have this conversation, who's the boss? Who's not the boss? How do these things work? We see that that web is much more complex. And the more that we can radically learn to assess the environment and see the invisible and make it visible, we start being able to answer these questions much more thoroughly. And for my students who are watching this, if any of this inspires you, put this on a yellow jig and try to talk with each other how you view your role in school. Otherwise, as always, I will see you in the next one. Take care.